Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States. And from this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
All right, so Trump's back in the White House for round 2, and already the world is kind of like, what's going on here?
Yeah, you can definitely say that, this inauguration is sending some pretty strong signals about how his foreign policy might play out.
Right, and it's not just like, the usual diplomatic back and forth. It's the guest list, or should I say the lack of guests, that's really raising eyebrows.
Yeah, some very big names are missing, and that's definitely noteworthy. We're talking Xi Jinping, Ursula von der Leyen, Volodymyr Zelensky, each for their own reasons.
Okay, so let's break this down. We've got a bunch of sources here to help us unpack all of this. Like that Financial Times article, Trump's Inauguration, A World Divided. They point out something interesting. No foreign leader has ever attended a U.S. presidential inauguration.
It's always been a very American affair, purely political. A symbolic passing of the torch. So for Trump to even extend invitations to foreign leaders is a break from tradition.
And we know from the New York Times piece, Xi declines Trump's invitation signaling chill in relations, that he actually invited Xi Jinping personally. That's a pretty big deal, right?
Huge. It suggests he's at least trying to project an image of openness towards China, maybe even a willingness to reset the relationship despite all the tensions we've seen.
But then Xi goes and declines the invitation.
Yeah, and that speaks volumes. It's like he's saying thanks, but no thanks. I'm not going to be a part of your show.
And the Bloomberg article, Inside Xi's Decision to Skip Trump's Inauguration, gives us some insight into why apparently his advisors were worried about the optics.
Imagine being in Xi's shoes. You show up at Trump's inauguration and he starts going off on China about trade or Taiwan. What does that look like back home?
Not good, I'd imagine.
Not good at all. It could make Xi look weak. Like he's been played by Trump. And let's be honest, Trump has a history of using people as props for his America First narrative.
Right. And we can't forget the whole history of the Trump-Xi relationship. The Washington Post piece, the Trump-Xi relationship, a timeline of turbulence, reminds us that it's been anything but smooth sailing.
Exactly. There's a lot of distrust there, a lot of unpredictability. So from Xi's perspective, it probably made sense to just stay away.
Okay, so Xi Jinping skipping the inauguration makes sense in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But what about Ursula von der Leyen? She wasn't even invited.
Yeah, the Politico article, von der Leyen snubbed, no invitation to Trump inauguration, makes that pretty clear. And that's a big deal because it suggests a deliberate cooling of relations with the European Union.
It's not exactly a secret that Trump has a, shall we say, complicated relationship with Europe.
Yeah, during his first term, he clashed with European leaders, repeatedly questioned the value of NATO, and imposed tariffs that really strained transatlantic trade.
It seems like he's picking up right where he left off.
Yeah, that's the message that a lot of people are taking away from this snub.
Which is pretty worrying when you think about all the challenges facing the world right now. Trade wars, the future of NATO, the whole global balance of power.
Right.
It's all hanging in the balance.
Right, and then you've got Volodymyr Zelensky. He wasn't invited either, but according to the Kiev Independent, Zelensky requests invitation to Trump inauguration, raising eyebrows in Washington. He actually asked to come.
Which is pretty interesting considering his history with Trump.
Yeah, things haven't exactly been rosy between those two. If you remember that CNN article, The Impeachment Inquiry, a refresher on Trump and Ukraine, it details that whole phone call where Trump pressured Zelensky to investigate his political rivals.
Yeah, that was a whole thing.
And even beyond that incident, Trump has often praised Putin and downplayed Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So Zelensky's in a really tough spot.
He desperately needs U.S. support to deal with Russia. But the U.S. president has a history of being unpredictable, transactional, and potentially sympathetic to his enemy.
It's a delicate situation, to say the least.
So we've got Xi Jinping making a calculated decision to stay away, Ursula von der Leyen being deliberately snubbed, and Volodymyr Zelensky practically begging to be let in.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a global landscape that's already incredibly tense and uncertain. It's a lot to unpack, and it raises a big question. How are these dynamics going to shape Trump's foreign policy in his second term?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And to get some answers, we need to look beyond the guest list and dive into the main event, Trump's inauguration speech.
So we've talked about who wasn't there. Now let's get into what Trump actually said.
Everyone's waiting to see, do his words match up with those empty seats.
Exactly. And the transcript is, well, it's pretty telling. The Wall Street Journal analyzed it in their piece, Trump's inaugural address, A Return to America First. And it's clear he's not backing down from his nationalist agenda.
Yeah, that Wall Street Journal article also pointed out how different this speech is from, the usual calls for global unity and cooperation we hear from world leaders.
It's a complete 180. He's basically saying America comes first and everyone else is going to have to fight for whatever scraps are left.
He even took some pretty direct shots at China, the EU, and even NATO allies.
Yeah, he went after China for their trade practices, accused the EU of unfair competition, and said that NATO allies aren't pulling their weight. It's like he's deliberately trying to poke the bear.
Or the dragon, or the whatever animal represents the EU.
Right, the point is he's not exactly trying to make friends here. And it raises a big question, is this just rhetoric, or is this a sign of a real shift in U.S. foreign policy?
That's what the Foreign Affairs article, The Decline of American Power, Assessing the Implications of Trump's Second Term, is asking. They seem to think we should take this America First 2.0 thing pretty seriously.
Yeah, I think they're right to be concerned. But to be fair, there are some potential upsides to this approach, at least according to some people.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a second. Yeah. The National Review actually made a case for Trump's foreign policy in their article, The Case for Trump's Foreign Policy. What's their argument?
Basically, they say that by challenging the status quo, by being willing to walk away from bad deals, Trump could actually get a better deal for America.
So less focus on multilateral institutions like the UN or NATO, and more emphasis on, bilateral deals, cutting deals that directly benefit the U.S.?
Exactly. And, they do have a point. Look at the Abraham Accords, for example. Those were brokered through direct negotiations between Israel and several Arab states. They basically bypassed the traditional multilateral frameworks, and it worked.
That's true. But even the people who support this approach admit that it's risky.
Yeah, the foreign policy article, Trump's Foreign Policy, A High-Risk Gamble, warns that alienating allies and undermining international norms could backfire big time. It could actually lead to more instability and conflict.
So it's a gamble, and the question is, does Trump have the skills to pull it off?
A lot of analysts are skeptical. The Economist piece, The World, according to Trump, a second-term preview, quotes a bunch of them, and they're not exactly optimistic.
Okay, so we've got a speech that lays out a vision of a more assertive, less cooperative America. But how is the rest of the world reacting to all of this?
That's the big question, and it's what we're going to dive into next. Buckle up, because the reactions are pouring in, and they're all over the place.
All right, so we've heard the speech. We've seen the reactions, or a lack thereof. And the big question is, what happens next?
Yeah, words are one thing, actions are another. So how are world leaders and global institutions actually responding to this America First 2.0 vibe?
Well, the initial reactions are a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, some countries are cautiously optimistic. They're hoping to find ways to work with the new administration. But others are deeply concerned about the potential for, instability and conflict. Especially in Europe. The Reuters article, European leaders express concern over Trump's inaugural address, really highlights that anxiety.
What are they most worried about?
A lot of things, actually. Trump's commitment to NATO, his protectionist trade policies, his unpredictable approach to diplomacy. They just don't know what to expect, and that uncertainty is breeding a lot of nervousness.
And it's not just talk. They're actually taking steps to prepare for a world where they might not be able to rely on the U.S. as much.
Exactly. The Financial Times reported that France and Germany are already talking about strengthening European defense cooperation. They're even floating the idea of an independent European military force, which would be a huge shift. I mean, think about it. For decades, Europe has relied on the U.S. for security. Now they're talking about going it alone.
That's a pretty big deal. And it's not just Europe. The Nikkei Asian Review had an article called Japan and South Korea Seek Closer Ties Amid U.S. Uncertainty. So it seems like Asian allies are also looking for ways to hedge their bets.
Yeah, they're realizing that they can't necessarily count on the U.S. to be the global policeman anymore. They need to diversify their partnerships and look out for their own interests.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the countries that aren't exactly U.S. allies? How are they reacting to all of this?
Well, Russia and China are definitely watching closely, and they're probably seeing both opportunities and challenges. The Moscow Times had a piece called Kremlin Sees Opportunity in Trump's Second Term. They're suggesting that Putin sees a chance to expand Russian influence if the U.S. steps back from the world stage.
Especially in places like Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where the U.S. has a big military presence.
Right. But it's not all good news for Russia. They're also worried about Trump's unpredictability and his willingness to use military force.
It's a bit of a gamble for them, too.
Definitely. And then there's China. The South China Morning Post article, China Wary of Trump's Unpredictability, points out that while China might benefit economically from a U.S. retreat from globalization, they're also concerned about Trump's, erratic behavior.
It's like they're trying to figure out how to deal with a loose cannon.
Exactly. And let's not forget about all the non-state actors out there. Terrorist organizations, cyber criminals, rogue states. They're all looking for ways to exploit any weakness or distraction in the international system.
Okay, so we've got a lot of moving pieces here. Alliances, shifting potential adversaries, maneuvering. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. These global power plays can have real impacts on our everyday lives.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one, economic instability. Trade wars and protectionist policies can lead to higher prices for goods and services. They can disrupt supply chains and even cost jobs.
We saw a bit of that during Trump's first term with the tariffs on China.
Exactly. And then there's the security risks. As global tensions rise and alliances fray, the likelihood of conflict increases, both conventional and unconventional. That means a greater risk of terrorism, cyber attacks, and even military confrontations.
So a more volatile, more dangerous, and potentially more expensive world. Not exactly a happy ending.
It's definitely a challenging landscape, but it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make choices, both individually and collectively, that can shape a more peaceful and prosperous future.
What do you mean? What can we actually do?
Well, for one, we can stay informed and engaged. We can educate ourselves about the issues, hold our leaders accountable, and support organizations that are working to promote diplomacy, cooperation, and understanding.
So knowledge is power and action is even more powerful.
Exactly. And we can also make choices in our own lives that reflect our values. Supporting businesses that operate ethically, reducing our environmental footprint, building bridges of understanding across cultures. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our actions have ripple effects, and that we can all play a role in shaping a more just and sustainable world.
That's a good point. So it's not just about geopolitics, it's about our shared future.
Exactly. And the choices we make today will determine what kind of world we leave for generations to come.
Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into the global implications of Trump's second inauguration.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the empty seats at the ceremony to the potential for a new era of uncertainty and instability.
But we've also talked about the power of knowledge, action, and hope. The future isn't set in stone. We can all play a part in shaping it.
So keep those brains buzzing, keep those conversations going, and join us next time for another deep dive into the issues that matter most.